Good morning, everyone. It is my privilege and pleasure to moderate these cross generational and cross cultural conversations. Our young professionals will interview our elder scholars and theologians who have a rich history participating in the civil rights movement. So, at this time, I would like to introduce the Reverend Dr. Marvin A. McMickle, who is both a scholar and theologian. He has doctorates in divinity, ministry, philosophy, and humane letters from Aurora University, Princeton Theological Seminary, Case Western Reserve University, and Payne Theological Seminary, respectively. He also earned a Master of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary and did additional graduate work at Columbia University in the city of New York. Dr. McMickle served as president of Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School. He was pastor of Antioch Baptist Church in Cleveland, Ohio, and professor emeritus as well. He's a member of the Martin Luther King Jr. International Board of Preachers at Morehouse College. He served as a board member for Cleveland State University, and he's also the author of 15 books, dozens of articles and scholarly articles and preaching commentaries as well. So welcome, Reverend Dr. McMickle.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. Also, I'd like to introduce Miss Abby Kushner Benson. She's currently a sophomore at the College of Worcester in Worcester, Ohio. She's majoring in anthropology and exploring options on what her minor might be. In addition to her studies, she plays for the women's Division III tennis team at the College of Worcester, and she's also on the student council for her school's Hillel as treasurer. Additionally, she's also on the Temple Israel Ritual Committee, and in her free time, she enjoys baking and exploring different types of art media. So if you would like any more information, there are more extensive bios on the Akron Urban League website, so I invite you to check those out. But at this time, I want to turn the floor to Abby, who is going to engage Reverend McMickle in a cross-generational, cross-cultural conversation.
Thank you. First off, it's so nice to meet both of you. But my first question would be, if you could you please describe your cultural identity, and how has your identity, particularly with regard to race and religion, been instrumental in your commitment to social justice?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm an African American, born and raised in Chicago, Illinois. I left Chicago, went to New York City, spent some time there, and then New Jersey. Left New Jersey and came to Cleveland. Left Cleveland and went to Rochester. So I think you could say that most of my time has been spent in two contexts. Context one, urban America, inner city America, and two, by the Great Lakes or by the Atlantic Ocean. So I've always lived near some major body of water, which means that it was places where there was a lot of migration. Folk from other countries, other cultures were always coming and going. So I've lived at the crossroads of America for most of my life. Now, how did that influence me? I think by virtue of being around diversity, I always found racial, cultural, religious diversity to be the norm. I was never surprised when an Islamic mosque or Jewish synagogue or a Buddhist temple showed up. I was never surprised when people in my schools, elementary and high school, came from multilingual families. Chicago was a town with at least 37 languages spoken in most schools. So diversity has never been my problem. Intolerance of diversity has always been my problem.
That's a great lead into my actual second question. And I was wondering if you could describe a time when you crossed like a racial, religious, or ethnic boundary and got a glimpse into the experience of others who did not share your cultural background.
Yeah. Believe it or not, I'm now 72 years old. So I was in college between 1966 and 1970. I was a pre-religion major, I was always heading toward the ministry. So in 1969, I was asked by the dean of the Department of Religion to spend a summer in a cultural context different than my own. I was sent to Baraboo, Wisconsin. Baraboo, Wisconsin doesn't have a Black person in the county. I was the only Black person in the county. And it's a primarily agricultural community, largely either dairy farmers or hay farmers. There was a kind of a symmetry. Some folk grew the hay that fed the cows. Other folks made the milk and the cheese products that came from the cows. I came from Chicago. I thought that milk came out of cartons, and I had no idea what hay was. I spent the summer of 1969 in a place that I would never otherwise have intentionally gone. The only thing that Baraboo was famous for besides its agriculture is it's the home of the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus. When the circus goes off the road, they spend their winters in Baraboo, Wisconsin. So yeah, I spent the summer with white farmers who took me into their home every night, a different one for dinner. I must say, once they got to know me and I got to know them, whatever suspicions we might have had about the other quickly melted away. It helped me to appreciate the fact that racism and bigotry is usually built upon not knowing much about the other person, and therefore it is easy to dehumanize them. Once you get to know them, once you spend time with them, once you sit with them for dinner, go with them to the movies, go with them to church, go with them out into the fields. Now, bear in mind, this is a farming community, so they were up at 4 a.m. and in bed by 8:30. I was always out of rhythm, I could never hook up with that. So I never tried to become a farmer. I would just catch them, off hours. But it was a great experience. I'm the better for that summer of 1969.
Yeah, wow, that would have been an incredible experience to see that.
Yeah.
So could you also explain how maybe this experience influenced your future life and career going into it, or elaborate a little bit further on that?
Yeah, I think for me, it has helped me to do a few things. It has helped me to not quickly categorize people. All white people are this, all Black people are that, all Asian people. When you spend that much time around folk different than yourself, you get to know them as persons. And I think the fact that so many people in this country live in racial isolation, they live in all white or all Black neighborhoods, or they go to all white or all Black schools, or they're in mostly white workplaces. They don't have the occasion to meet people and sit with them long enough to know them as individuals. I would say that one of the things that Dr. King worked really hard at was to maintain multi-generational and multicultural involvement in the civil rights movement. And I think the movement suffered greatly when it ceased to be a multi-generational and multicultural movement. So yeah, I think that summer helped me slow down in rushing to judgment about people based upon their color, their religion, their vocation, their social location. Yeah, I'm better for that.
Thank you so much for that. And my next question relates to what you were getting at about with the stereotypes of both Blacks and Jewish people. Which ones have been the most troubling with regard to the social justice agenda you have fought for? And how can people help to eradicate these stereotypes?
Yeah. Well, of course, both groups have had a long history of oppression based upon identity. African Americans based upon physical identity as color. For many Jewish people, not just Jewish Americans, Jewish people over the millennia going back, to pre-Christian era, it was oppression based upon theology, based upon ritual, based upon monotheism as opposed to polytheism, oppression based upon their observances of laws that other folks found to be constraining. But either way, for the last at least 2,000 years, there's been a systematic identification of Jewish people and Judaism as, in quotes, the other. And for the last 600 years, since the 1430s, when the Europeans finally decided to invade the African continent, there's been an other component to Black people. What's sad for me is when people who've had different experiences of oppression turn around and try to think about one another as other. So, many Black people accuse many Jewish people of one thing or another. Many Jewish people may, I don't know that to be the case, may share, because many of them are white, they may share some of the racial ideology of other white people. It seems to me that when you've been the victim of oppression, you ought to be the last person to do it to somebody else. And that, I would hope that would be the case.
Yeah, that is very much the hope. In regards to the lines between Blacks and Jews in the struggle for the civil rights, it's very steeped in the history of this. What does allyship look like in the 21st century for both Jewish and Black communities?
Well, something miraculous, and I don't use the word miraculous very often for earthly events, unless I think there's a touch of the divine involved. But I think people should know that this week, an African-American clergyman and the son of Jewish immigrants, Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff, were both elected to the United States Senate from the most unlikely of places, Georgia.
Yes.
Both of them are the first of their constituent, first of their group to ever be elected like that. They are kind of a reincarnation. I'm not sure if you know much about the partnership between Martin Luther King Jr. and Abraham Joshua Heschel, a famous rabbi who left Europe because of the Holocaust and came to New York City. But they were really fast friends, not only in the civil rights movement, but also in the anti-Vietnam War movement. They collaborated in forming an organization called Christians and Jews Concerned About Vietnam. And I see in the Warnock-Ossoff emergence a reincarnation of that at a different level. So instead of being on the outside advocating in, they are suddenly on the inside. I mean, really on the inside in the United States Senate. I hope people saw them campaigning together. I hope people saw them defending one another when they were being separately attacked. And I hope that others will see opportunities for that kind of intercultural collaboration in politics and in other aspects of life.
Yeah, I was very excited when I learned the news about the election results in Georgia.
Yeah.
Very grateful that that had happened. For my next question, I was wondering, so how do we maintain the focus on larger social justice issues of our time and still create allyship among one another and continue that growth?
It is difficult to maintain a relationship unless both parties are equally convicted about the issue. Social justice is not something that comes and goes. It's not a problem that is solved and we move on.
Mm.
Social justice is racism. Social justice is sexism. Social justice is homophobia. Social justice is poverty. Social justice is the battle against the destruction of the environment. So I think you go from target to target, and you form alliances as you find other people who are rallied around those issues. Not everybody who is against racism is also an environmentalist. Not everybody who is against sexism is also, up for law and order police reform. So different people get plugged in to social justice at different points, and they tend to find some colleagues in one place and some colleagues in another. And if your friends in the fight against racism don't want to go to the fight against environmental justice, that's okay. You got to have new friends over there. I don't hold against anybody if they don't see the world through my lens. But when we do see the world through the same lens and we can work together, I'm always anxious for that partnership.
Reverend McMickle, you mentioned earlier your participation, or you brought up the notion of the civil rights movement. Can you tell us a little bit about your participation? I know you were probably a young college student.
No, high school.
At a lot of the time. Okay, can you share with us your experiences?
As I mentioned, I may have mentioned my hometown in Chicago. And in the summer of 1966, Martin Luther King Jr. brought the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to Chicago in partnership with a local civil rights group led by a man named Al Raby, R-A-B-Y, because Dr. King wanted to demonstrate that the problem of racial segregation was not a Southern problem. People in the North, kind of looked down on the South as if to say, well, that's where the problem is, Mississippi, Georgia, the Carolinas, Texas, Louisiana. When in point of fact, the four most racially segregated cities in America in 1966 were, in this order, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, and Gary, Indiana. In terms of neighborhood segregation, it was much more entrenched in the North than it was in the South, in part because of sheer demographics, So he came to Chicago in 1966 for an open housing demonstration. I was working a summer job, read about the demonstrations in the newspaper, went on the first night that he was going to preach at Liberty Baptist Church on what was then South Parkway, what is now Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, in part because of that. Got involved in the marches and the demonstrations, going to City Hall, going out where there were white Nazis and Nazi banners and Confederate flags in Chicago. Confederate flags in Chicago. Our job was to march alongside. They had two kind of marchers. Some walked in columns, like 6 or 8 across, and then younger people would march on the outside of the columns. Our job was to catch, block, or deter thrown objects from hitting the line of marchers. And so, I got hit with everything you can imagine and called everything you can imagine. But we persisted, pray-ins, sit-ins, kneel-ins, sing-ins, march-ins, bleed-ins. At the end of that summer, Chicago was as racially segregated as it was before we started. Which was his point? Segregation is entrenched in the culture of America, not just in the culture of the South. But you had to expose it so the world could see it. And it isn't much better as Black people in Chicago moved into what were at one time white neighborhoods, white folk just moved out. And when they couldn't move out into anything that was existing, they would create new communities in the wilderness just to get away from integration. Create new school systems, create new cities, create new shopping malls. White flight was true then, and I think it's still true today. There is just a fundamental resistance on the part of many people in this country to embrace a multicultural living environment. And so, yeah, now I've been involved since then. 1966 got me started. I've been the president of both the Urban League and the NAACP in Cleveland, also the NAACP in New Jersey. So, I mean, I tried to carry this banner on, but it was clear that the summer of 1966 and that months-long struggle was my introduction to this and to the deeply entrenched nature of our struggle. I also should tell you, I was never arrested with Martin King, but I was arrested with Ralph Abernathy, who was his number 2 guy. And that was in 1971 in New York City. We were picketing through Operation Breadbasket, which was the national arm of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference on Economic Development. And Jesse Jackson was at that time the national president. But in New York, there was a chapter, and we were campaigning against the A&P food chain, Atlantic and Pacific food chain, because they had no Black store managers anywhere in America in 1971. Lots of clerks, lots of stock people, but nobody was running a store in 1971. And so we decided to have a protest and a boycott of A&P, and they weren't giving in. So we finally did a sit-in in the corporate headquarters of A&P, which was on 42nd Street between 5th Avenue and I think Lexington, somewhere in there in Manhattan. We went in at 4:59 because we knew that it was going to close at 5. Our intention was to get arrested for trespassing in order to force the issue. We stayed for an hour, and then they called the New York City police, and we were all put into paddy wagons and thrown in jail. And don't you know it, I looked up, and there was Ralph David Abernathy in my jail cell. And so there we sat for a couple of days until they finally released us without charges. And the next day, we went right back.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for that. I was just wondering also, I know there's many parallels to the protests happening this past summer and that are continuing going on for the Black Lives Matter movement. I was wondering if you could possibly point out like some differences you saw between the social justice, civil rights movement protests, like the parallels and the differences you see today.
Yeah. Most of the demonstrations of my generation were initiated by us in pursuit of a policy. Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Bill, to desegregate a lunch counter, to enter a university. There were obvious social policies that could be named, attacked, and defeated. You could desegregate a bus. That was your victory. You could desegregate a lunch counter. That was your victory. You could make segregation in public accommodations illegal. That's your victory. What do you do about racism? How do you attack racism? Not a racist policy, not even a racist person, a racist structure, a systemic problem. So it's much more difficult to claim a victory in the current atmosphere because the target is different. You're not going after a change in a policy. You're going after a change in the fundamental structure of a society rooted in historical racial disparities. And we had very few instances when our marches were in memory of a deceased person. In Selma, Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed. James Reeb was killed. Viola Liuzzo was killed. But all of them were there around the bigger issue of the march from Selma to Montgomery and voting rights. Why was Breonna Taylor killed? Why was George Floyd killed? Why was Ahmaud Arbery killed? Why was the man who was shot in the back 7 times in Kenosha, Wisconsin, left paralyzed? So much of the Black Lives Matter movement is to make that very point. Black lives matter except to law enforcement or except to the state or federal government. So when the district attorney in Kenosha, Wisconsin, or the county thereof, whatever the county is, I don't know, ruled that the man who shot someone in the back 7 times was not going to be charged. No evidence that he broke any laws. Man's back is turned. He's leaning into the car. He is of no threat to you. And you shoot him. Okay, you shot him. 7 times? It's like kneeling on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 42 seconds. How long does it take to subdue somebody before you realize you just put him to death? So what the current demonstrations are doing is not so much calling attention to a policy that can be easily challenged in court. So much more difficult. How do you bring in front of the American viewing public the brutality that, at least from my point of view, African Americans are subject to every day? I don't care how many doctoral degrees I have, when I walk away from people who know me and I find myself out in the middle of America, I become not Dr. McMickle, I become not Reverend McMickle, I become another Black man subject to all of the stereotypes that this society heaps upon us. That is a tough problem to resolve. So I commend those who are out there today because they're facing a somewhat different battle than we faced 50 years ago.
Thank you so much for sharing about that. I had not exactly seen like the two differences in that light, so that was very helpful in understanding that. My next question would be, how would the issues of such as health disparities and disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on the Black community interrelate with the civil rights and social justice concerns?
Yeah. When I was living in Rochester, New York, between 2011 and 2019, I was made aware that there'd been an act of civil uprising in Rochester in 1964. And 50 years later, there was a revisiting of the reasons for that. The leader of the uprising in 1964 said there were 4 issues. The issues were quality of housing, quality of education, quality of healthcare, and the general problem of poverty. 1964. 50 years later, they asked the same man, so what do you think are the prevailing issues today? You know what he said? The quality of housing, the quality of education, the quality of healthcare, and the quality or the problem of poverty. As I said before, it is easy to change a segregation law. It is easy to integrate a neighborhood because it doesn't stay integrated very long. You move in, they move out. Do you know my family, when I was in my first year in college, while I was in college, they moved on me. I didn't come back for Thanksgiving to the same house I had left around Labor Day. I thought perhaps they were trying to get rid of me and not tell me where they were going. Okay. Anyway, we moved to 82nd and Loomis on Chicago's southwest side. We were among the first or second Black families to move there in 1967. Within 2 years, that entire neighborhood was Black. Now, we could not have moved in at that rate if white families had not moved out. So integration can be done because white folks are going to move out. Underneath are these persistent inequities. When white people move out, the quality of education goes down. When white people move out, the quality of police patrolling shifts. The support of the city in terms of city services travels with them. So what COVID-19 has done, and I use this because a friend of mine gave me this visual. COVID-19 is like a CAT scan of American society. You can't see it from the outside, but COVID-19 gave us a chance to look at what's really happening underneath the surface. Black people are struggling because of pre-existing conditions. Okay, a lot of those are self-inflicted: diabetes, heart disease, lung cancer, so forth and so on. But also because they live in homes made of wood with lead-based paint, because there are disproportionate numbers of garbage facilities and incinerators where they live, because they live in food deserts where no fresh food is either available or affordable, because they can't afford health care and might not have a job that provides health insurance. All that becomes obvious. And then they have jobs that are frontline, but not doctors and nurses, bus drivers, grocery store clerks, people who don't operate in the hospital. They prepare the food, or they cook the meals, or they transport the patients. You can't do a lot of jobs from home. You can't work from home if you are a bus driver or school security officer. You got to go out and face the public. And so COVID has exposed us to what life is like for working class people, Black and white, and for people who do not have access to quality medical care. The thought that this last administration wanted to remove health insurance in the middle of a pandemic was about as unimaginable an act as I could ever have considered. And thank God they were not successful. But yeah, COVID-19 has been a CAT scan, and we have seen ourselves much more clearly. And the picture is not very pretty.
True. That was an amazing metaphor to put on to that. In doing so, I was wondering what programs or initiatives can we possibly create locally to educate Black and Jewish youth about both cultures and their rich history, about fighting social injustice?
Mm-hmm. When I was the president of the NAACP in Cleveland, which would have been 90 to 94, I worked with the Jewish Community Federation in Cleveland on a joint trip to Senegal and Israel. Why? Senegal was one of the port cities for the slave trade. And it was the home of an island called Goree, Goree, Goree Island, which was where captured persons were held in caves, in cages, huddled together, packed in like sardines, until a slave ship could come and it could load persons onto the ship. Now follow this imagery. Down a long, dark, narrow corridor, at the end of which was a door that opened up onto a plank that you'd walk onto the slave ship. It was called the door of no return, because you either got on the slave ship or you got shot and you fell into the ocean and the sharks would come and eat you up. So we went to Goree Island to talk about slavery. We then went to Jerusalem to Yad Vashem, to the Holocaust Museum, most especially the Children's Museum. When we think about the Holocaust, we tend to think about older people, men and women, 35, 40, 45, 50 and older. What the Children's Museum attached to Yad Vashem revealed was the 1.6 million children killed. Not always gassed, but killed, burned or shot or gassed. So that we took with us, here's my point, we took school teachers and administrators from the Cleveland Public School, the Cleveland Roman Catholic Diocese, the Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights school districts, so inner city, suburban, public, and parochial, so that they could begin to craft a curriculum in the schools that would help them teach successive generations about human suffering. Now, if I were to do that again, I wouldn't necessarily go out of the country. I would say, let's take our Jewish brothers and sisters and our Black brothers and sisters, and let's go to Standing Rock in North Dakota. And let's listen as the Lakota Sioux talk to us about their experience and about treaties that were made that were never kept, and about oil pipelines that are being constructed through what is for them sacred land. But more than that, land that provides underwater reservoirs for drinking water for 6 surrounding states. But these people who want this pipeline don't care about drinking water because they don't live in those states. They just want to move the oil from Canada to the Midwest, from the Midwest to the Gulf Coast. Oil pollution be damned. So there are many stories that we need to hear. I think the most untold, lots of movies are coming out that tell the truth about slavery, many more coming out that tell the truth about the experience of the Holocaust and Judaism's history of oppression. Most Americans still think about Native Americans as wild and hostile and uncivilized. I think North Dakota, South Dakota, Arizona, New Mexico. I live in a county. I live in Cuyahoga County. Cuyahoga is not an English word. It's a Native American word. But the people whose word that is are gone. The next county over is Geauga County. It is also not an English word, but the people who live there are gone. Where are they? How are they doing? The highest levels of drug addiction, homicide, depression, drug overdosing, the highest levels of all of these social factors are on Native American reservations. and we act as if it doesn't matter.
Abby, I think we have time for probably one more question.
That was such a good point that you made, though, Reverend McMickle, and I wanted to thank you for that. To close out the last question, I heard that you actually had met Martin Luther King Jr. Among like the marches you've attended. Would you like to share and elaborate more on that experience? That is incredible to hear about.
Yeah. Martin Luther King Jr. was 5'7". I'm going to start with that. 5'7".
Wow.
First time I saw him was in Liberty Baptist Church in Chicago in 1966. I was already seated. He had not yet come in. The program usually starts before he even gets there. They're singing and other folks are talking, and he'll kind of come in, rushing from one event to the other. So I was sitting there, and all of a sudden, it's like at an athletic stadium, a wave starts to occur. And I just noticed folks from the back to the front, row after row after row, standing up. But I'm on the other side of the center aisle, so I don't know what's going on. I don't see anything except everybody's giving up and cheering and hooting and shouting. I said, what in the world is going on? Well, finally, he got past the pews and he got up onto the podium. And the first time I ever saw him in the flesh was standing up there on the podium, greeting the people and smiling and accepting the ovation. And then, of course, I saw him and, met with him. Now, bear in mind, I'm 17 years old. So I'm not exactly, his right-hand man. I was never asked over for dinner, nothing like that. So it was sort of a teenager activist association with, admiration for, but I would also say commitment to. Not a person, but a way of life. For Martin Luther King Jr., nonviolence was not a tactic. It was a decision to live your life in a certain way, on and off the camera. And I think he knew. I'll tell you, one night we were at a rally and they asked him to give a speech in a park. Well, not uncommon, but it was at night on a bandstand with a spotlight only on him in Chicago under death threats. Everybody said, you can't go out there. You cannot go out there by yourself under a spotlight. Somebody's going to shoot you. He went, he gave the speech. He didn't care. He already knew he would die before he was 40. Therefore, maximize your effort for as long as you can, because you just know. That was 1966. 2 years later, he was dead. Standing on a balcony, man, right across 2 streets. I've been there, the Lorraine Motel, the rooming house, perfect line of vision, high-powered rifle. I will tell you, just so people understand, to say that he was shot is to understate the issue. This was a rifle designed for hunting animals, high-powered velocity. It literally almost tore his head off his neck. He was dead when he dropped. But he knew it was coming. And I think the thing that most of us who knew him admire most was the acceptance of the fact that all of us were going to keep living. He wasn't. He knew it, but he was ready to die for what he believed in, and nothing frightened him. John Lewis, by the way, John Lewis was the same way. Either one of them was prepared to die at a moment's notice. John lived to be 80. Martin King lived to be 39. I'm 72 and still here.
Reverend McMickle, you mentioned that Dr. King had one of his major tenets was nonviolent resistance, nonviolent protest. Do you want to give us any final words on looking at that legacy in juxtaposition to the events that occurred yesterday?
Thank you for that opportunity. If there's one thing that those of us who were involved in the civil rights demonstration were told over and over and over again, is that we are not there to inflict damage. We're not there to instigate problems or fights. If we're hit, we're not supposed to hit back. It was non-violent in the sense that we will accept abuse, but never inflict it. The event that I saw on television yesterday, one, was not restrained by law enforcement. I want to start with that. I have seen Black marchers peacefully walking down the street and confronted by police officers with motorized vehicles in SWAT gear and high-powered rifles to surround and harass absolutely nonviolent, unarmed Black protesters. Ferguson, Missouri, the best example, but also in Washington last June. Donald Trump wanted to walk from the White House to St. John's Episcopal Church. He used the National Guard to clear the way. Pepper spray, gas, folk on horseback. Yesterday was an insurrection. Let's not use the wrong word. It was not a protest. It was not a demonstration. It was an unsuccessful coup of the US government designed to prevent Joe Biden and Kamala Harris from being confirmed by the Senate according to the US Constitution. And that coup was not against Trump's government. That coup was instigated by the President of the United States. And I just want to end by saying, I'd like to know why he's not in jail right now, because he committed treason by instigating people to engage in civil insurrection against their own government with his vice president sitting in the building. I never in my life dreamed I would see anything like that, not just the protest, but him talking, urging them to do that. That's the problem. Now contrast that with Martin King, who when hit would turn the other cheek, and when insulted would just keep going, but would never in 1,000 years have thought about violence or tearing up property or breaking out windows or going through somebody's desk. Now, let me just say this last thing. When I saw somebody carrying the Confederate battle flag through the United States Capitol, the center of our resistance to the Confederacy, I thought we had fought a war to keep that flag lowered forever. And here was a man, proud as he could be, carrying the Confederate battle flag through the US Capitol. I hope they got his picture. I hope they can track him down. I hope he'll go to jail. This is intolerable. He shouldn't have been there in the first place. But to carry the Confederate flag, that was an insurrection. You see, that was an attempt to overthrow the government. And that members of the government are speaking on behalf of that action. You know, Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and Matt Gaetz and that crowd. You know, I didn't think I'd live to see a Black president, but I did. I didn't think I'd ever live to see American citizens attack the US Capitol, but I did, and I'm heartbroken.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Miss Abby Kushner Benson. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Marvin McMickle. It's been a pleasure to share this stage with you. Thank you for participating with us in our celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. And I wanted to say thank you to all of our guests in the audience for joining us today.
Yes, thank you
Thanks
so
for having me.
It's been an honor. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. I've enjoyed being with you. I wish you all the best at Worcester. I've been there a few times.